Okay.
Good morning, Melinda Ham. Thanks for joining us here at Yellow Shelf.
Oh, thanks so much for the opportunity. Really appreciate it. Yeah, thank you.
It's an absolute pleasure. Your book came into my world maybe about a month ago. So I'm excited to chat to you. I want to know what the book's about. What do we need to know about your new-ish book, The Lucky Ones?
I think what I've tried to do in the book is put a human face on the refugee issue. Like the global refugee issue is scary. Like there are 38 million refugees at the moment, people who have been persecuted in their own country um, for human rights issues, for their religion, for their political beliefs, and they've run away from their country. They've fled, and some of them have been violently abused. Some of them have been tortured. Some of them have been detained. And there are 38 million people at the moment who are in neighboring countries, who are in refugee camps, who are just spreading around the globe to get away from their country. And 38 million, what kind of number is that? That's like the whole population of Canada. You can tell by my
Yeah,
really
your accent. Yeah.
accent that I come from Canada. That's like the whole population of the state of California, 38 million, or it's like whatever, 7 times the population of Sydney or Melbourne. So those people are waiting to be resettled.
Yeah.
And there in the Australia's history, we have resettled, believe it or not, if you ignore what all the politicians say, we have resettled 1 million refugees, and that's something to be really, really proud of. And what I tried to do in my book is to put a human face on this issue. And I found 7 families and I covered their stories. I sat with them and talked to them about why they left their country, what happened to them, how they journeyed to Australia, and how they were accepted to be, come into Australia, and how they resettled, and what they did in Australia, and how they made an amazing life for themselves and for their kids. And so, I mean, what I'm trying to do in the book is to take, ordinary Australian readers and take them on that journey. Like they're walking with me beside these refugees.
Yeah.
And it's told in a narrative nonfiction style, which means I try to evoke the smell and the sounds and the what the people see and the whole sort of experience they went through.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is in their words because I sat with them and interviewed them and got their exact quotes. So yeah, it's just trying to bring out the compassion in the readers and the understanding of the refugee crisis. So it's not just 38 million people, and that's just a number we can't
Yeah.
sort of focus on. so
Yeah.
I looked at like from the main period of refugees coming into Australia. It began right after the Second World War. And I look at these families' journeys up to the present day. And I look at people who came from Poland after the Second World War, and from Vietnam, and from the Democratic Republic of Congo in Africa, and Tibet, which is an annexed part of China now,
Yeah.
and also from Iraq and Afghanistan in the 21st century. And I think it's really important because people, why by reading my book, will also understand why those people left those countries and what the political sort of upheavals were happening at that time. And at the same time, not in a boring way, like I try not to make it boring, but I try to sort of talk about Australia's refugee policy that was
Yeah.
morphing at that time while these refugees were coming into the country. So, in a nutshell, it's putting a human face on a global issue and talking about, in the Australian context,
Yeah.
why we should care about it.
Yeah, and you do that so well, that human lens, that feeling of compassion and really that feeling of understanding someone's story and what they walked, the journey they took. Melinda, I'd love you to share a little bit about you and what inspired you to write. Why write this book? And was this your first book? Like, I guess I'm curious about your background and what brought you here to write the book.
Yeah, so I originally wrote the book, and it was accepted by a firm who's my publisher. But they said, we really love this book, but you're not in it. We want you to be in the book.
Yeah.
So I had to go back and
Okay.
interject my story, and it's interwoven in the whole story.
Yeah.
And I think one thing that's really important that I have to say from the onset is that I'm not a refugee.
Yeah.
I am a migrant and I have to acknowledge my privilege. So I didn't experience all the hardship and all
Sure.
the terrible things that these people that I interviewed, they
Yeah.
went through. So, but my story is also interwoven in that because I do have an international background. So I was born and raised in Canada,
Yeah.
and then I went to university in England. And when I was in England, I got quite politicized, I guess, and became an activist in the anti-apartheid movement, which
Okay.
was the movement which was fighting against the regime in South Africa at the time, which was incredibly racist and was making basically a separate state for Black people and a separate state for white people, and white people were the privileged people. And after I finished my journalism degree, I had the fantastic opportunity to go to work as a foreign correspondent in Southern Africa. So I lived in Southern Africa for 6 years, working as a correspondent for the American Associated Press and some other British publications like the Daily Telegraph in Britain and other things. So it was an incredible opportunity. But what I got to see was refugees firsthand and really interview them for the very first time. So as a young 20-year-old, 20-something-year-old, I was in Malawi. That was the first country I was in. And at the time, Mozambique was having a civil war. And refugees were fleeing into Malawi. Malawi is this little tiny country in southern Africa with 8 million people. And refugees were fleeing into that country. And the Malawian people, they were welcoming them with open arms. And it was
Oh,
incredible.
yeah.
And just this amount of compassion and understanding and care from these incredibly poor people. Malawi is one of the poorest countries in the world. And it was really heartbreaking and heartwarming at the same
Really.
time because these people who were leaving Mozambique, they had their babies on their back, they just had the clothes they were standing up on, and they had nothing, and they were welcomed by the Malawian people and the Malawian government. And I saw that over and over again in the different countries that I worked in Southern Africa. And then I emigrated to Australia, and that was in the mid 90s by then. And Australia at that time was still very open to bringing in refugees and asylum seekers. But then at the
Yeah.
beginning of the 21st century, things changed dramatically. And um, Australia being one of the wealthiest countries in the world per capita, with a relatively small population, I was a bit horrified. I'm like, oh my gosh, like I've been in this like little tiny poor country that's been so
Yeah.
magnanimous towards refugees,
Yeah.
and then I'm in this big wealthy country, and what can I do about it? Is that how everybody feels? So I
Yeah.
started to work for as a volunteer for the Asylum Seekers Center.
Okay.
One of the things that I did there was I went out and worked as a community speaker, going out and talking to
Mm.
Rotary clubs and schools and community groups and talking to them about refugees and trying to change the narrative. And I found that actually I didn't have to change the narrative because often when people started to understand the human stories and why
Yeah.
people had come here as refugees, there was a massive amount of compassion and understanding among ordinary Australians.
Yeah.
So I thought, hey, we got to get these stories out there.
Yeah.
so,
Yay.
so that's what I did. I through my journalism network. So by then I was working for the Sydney Morning Herald and the Sun Herald. I found people who were willing to tell their stories, who'd come and settled in Australia, who'd come here as refugees, and who wanted to help change the narrative and wanted to tell their whole journey for why they left their country and how they settled here. And that was incredible. That I mean, it took a while, but I finally found 7 families, and I wanted to find people who were not famous. We
Yeah.
have heard about the Andos and
Yes.
other, people have become surgeons and lawyers
Yeah.
and famous artists and that kind of thing who were refugees. But I wanted to tell the story of ordinary people.
Yes.
And I also wanted to tell the story of ordinary people who'd had extraordinary lives and also the stories of women And I think there have been some refugee stories told about women, but I think a lot of the stories about refugee women are not told. So I found families that the women were willing to speak, and that also I could delve into the next generation of women, the women who either came here at a young age or who were born here, and their experience. So that's what I try to unpack in my book.
Wow. And look, what a journey yourself to, to get to that point of being able to write and being able to connect and really put that human lens. So, yeah, really interesting journey yourself, Melinda.
Yeah, it's been really fun, but I mean, I couldn't have done it obviously without the families that were willing to
Sure.
share their stories. I mean, just briefly, I can just sort of would you like me to talk about some of the families that I
Yeah, look, just just maybe give us one snapshot of a family.
yeah, so there was one family who came from Tibet. And the woman is called Dolma, and the husband is called Jigme. And they had both grown up on farms in Tibet, subsistence farms, very poor.
Yes.
And as young people, they'd fled they not fled, but like run away to the
Yeah.
city because they wanted to have some excitement. And in the city, they connected with Dolma's uncle, who had been part of the whole uprising. I mean, this is probably going into too much detail, but in 1959 there was a massive uprising of nuns and priests, who Buddhist nuns and priests, who were rising up against the Chinese government.
Yes.
And many of them had fled to other countries, and others were detained. And the Dalai Lama had fled to India, where he now lives in exile.
Yes.
So Dolma's uncle, he said, will you be a courier for me, going to India where the Dalai Lama is, and bringing back prayer flags and books and other things to
Oh,
disseminate in Tibet?
wow.
So that's what Dolma ended up doing. She is a very tiny woman,
Yes.
and she went, like, we're talking, she went over the mountains, but this is Mount Everest. She didn't go over them, she went around them.
Yeah, yeah.
Mountain pass to India. And in India, she went to Dharamsala, where the Dalai Lama is, and she was given this big backpack full of all these things she was going to disseminate when she came back. So she did that for many years.
Yeah.
So she was kind of a revolutionary in her own way. But then, after she'd done it for a few years, she and her partner at the time, Jigme, he also came with her. And one time they came back, and it was the anniversary of that uprising in 1959 I
Yeah.
talked to you about, and they didn't realize it. And the Chinese border guards were onto it.
Yeah.
So they got them, they found them, they
Yeah.
found the stuff that they were taking, and they were taken into detention. They were detained for 3 years without trial and tortured.
Wow.
So, and those people, after they'd gone through that experience, they're like, "We're out of here. We're just
Yeah.
like, we're gonna leave Tibet in any way we can." So
Yeah.
they eventually did, and
Yeah.
they came
Wow.
to Australia. But that's just one of the,
Yeah.
people who have done extraordinary things. I mean, they had a very, ordinary upbringing, but they stumbled on a situation where they could do something to help their communities, and then they eventually have come to Australia. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, that's a beautiful story in such a challenging environment. But I guess that's the taster of what your book's about. You're going to get these stories, of families and their countries they came from. It's definitely a recommendation for people to go and dive into your book. Hey, Melinda.
Yeah, no, it's true. And you wouldn't believe it. Like Dolma and Jigme, they work in hospitals in Western Sydney as orderlies.
Oh,
Like,
wow.
yeah, they work several jobs actually. They also work as checkout people in big supermarkets. So you never know what's behind
Oh,
a face. You don't know what their story is until you ask.
yeah.
And
That's not something to take away, is it? Like you never know people's backstory. Isn't that true?
no, you never know their
Yeah.
stories. So
Yeah, well, I'm sure you've done a wonderful job in capturing their story and many others. Melinda, what if we're curious about the book? What if we're curious about connecting you? What's the best way? I'll put this in the show notes. How do we get the book?
so you can, or in Australia, you can get it at any bookseller online or in your local bookshop,
Yeah,
Readings, Dymocks. And then internationally, you can get it as an ebook. So you can get it
fabulous.
internationally on Amazon. We
Yes.
don't have an audio book. If anybody out there wants to make an audio book of it, come on down.
There's a goal. Yeah.
We're,
Perfect.
we're working on the audiobook,
Yeah.
on getting it into an audiobook. But if they want to connect with me personally, they can connect with me on Facebook, Melinda Ham. Just, send me a direct message or ask friend request, and the same with LinkedIn. And
Yeah.
I'm really, really interested. Like, this is what I love. Like, I think I've done about 25 events so far. And what I really love is after I talk, people come up from the audience and they share their stories. That's what I
Yeah.
want. I want to hear about people who have had experience, living or working with refugees, people who are refugees, people
Yes.
who are children of refugees.
Yeah.
I think that's what gives me a lot of joy is to hear people, people in the audience, readers, their experience. And also I'd love to hear everybody's, reaction to the book. It's,
Yeah.
and not everybody loves it because it's got, I interweave the stories. Some
Sure.
people, it's
Yeah.
really confusing. And some people don't like the fact that I'm in the book, but everybody's entitled to their
Oh, well,
opinion.
yeah. And
But I
look,
love.
I mean, yeah. No, I was going to say, I think, yeah, if people take a read and if they do want to share, I'll put it in the show notes, the best way to connect with you. I mean, I think if enough people share, Melinda, there might be lucky ones too. There might be more stories that you can tell, more of those backstories, those amazing migration and refugee backstories. It's fascinating. Well done on the book.
Thank you. And thanks for the opportunity. It's been so amazing. Thank you.
Look, and promise if there's another book down the track, will you come back and talk to us?
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, readers, come and tell me your stories and I'll have more material.
Wonderful. Thanks, Melinda.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.